There's a question I hear all the time from people approaching retirement. Not just occasionally, constantly. It usually sounds something like this. Just tell me the number. What percentage can I safely withdraw every year without worrying about running out of money? Is it 4%, 5%, 3.5%? What's the real answer? And honestly, I understand why people ask. Because retirement is different from every other financial goal you've ever had. When you're working, your paycheck keeps showing up. You make mistakes, you recover. The market drops, you keep investing. You have time. Retirement changes the entire equation. Suddenly, instead of building wealth, you're depending on it. Instead of contributing to your portfolio is contributing to you. And that shift can feel terrifying. Because now every spending decision carries emotional weight. Every vacation, every home repair, every dinner out with friends, every gift to your grandchildren. Every dollar spent raises the same silent question. Will I still be okay 20 years from now? So naturally, we want certainty. We want a simple rule, a neat little formula, a single percentage that tells us exactly what we can spend for the rest of our lives. But after decades of retirement research, thousands of case studies, and millions of retirees navigating this journey, I've got something important to tell you. There is no perfect number. There never was. And strangely enough, that's actually good news. Because the people who succeed most in retirement aren't the ones who find the perfect withdrawal rate. They're the ones who build a system that adapts. Today, I want to show you why. I want to walk through how withdrawal rates really work, why the famous 4% rule isn't the entire story, and how the smartest retirement plans aren't built around a single number at all. They're built around flexibility. And once you understand this, retirement planning becomes much less scary and much more empowering. The biggest retirement myth. Let's start with a myth that has caused confusion for years. The myth is this: there is one safe withdrawal rate for everyone. You hear it everywhere. Some people say 4%, others insist on 3%, others claim 5%, and people argue about these numbers as though one side has discovered the truth and everyone else is wrong. But imagine asking a completely different question. Imagine walking into a real estate office and asking, what's the right price for a house? Well, what house? Where is it located? What city? What condition? What interest rates are available? What year are we talking about? A house in 1982 is not priced the same as a house in 2006. A house in rural America isn't priced like one in Manhattan. The question itself is incomplete. And that's exactly what happens when someone asks, what's the safe withdrawal rate? Because the answer depends on the environment. It depends on what kind of market you're retiring into. It depends on inflation. It depends on bond yields. It depends on stock valuations. It depends on how flexible you're willing to be. And most importantly, it depends on what the future ends up looking like. That's why retirement researchers don't all agree on one number. Not because they're confused, not because they're changing their minds, but because reality changes, and retirement plans have to change with it. Why we crave certainty. I think this goes deeper than money. Human beings naturally want certainty. We want guarantees. We want to know that if we follow the instructions correctly, everything will work out. Retirement doesn't offer that, and that can feel uncomfortable. Because retirement is one of the few financial decisions where you're trying to predict the next 20, 30, or even 40 years. Think about that for a moment. Can any of us accurately predict what the world will look like in 2056? Of course not. We don't know future inflation. We don't know future interest rates. We don't know future tax laws. We don't know future healthcare costs. We don't know future market returns. Yet retirement planning asks us to make decisions today that will affect us decades from now. That's why no retirement strategy is ever based on certainty. It's based on probability. And understanding that distinction changes everything. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is resilience. What actually determines a withdrawal rate? At its core, a withdrawal rate is simply a mathematical estimate. That's all it is. It isn't magic. It isn't a guarantee. It's an estimate based on assumptions, and those assumptions revolve around 5 major factors. 1. Future investment returns. This is the big one. If your portfolio earns more, you can spend more. If your portfolio earns less, you need to spend less. Simple. But here's the challenge. Future returns aren't known in advance. We can estimate them, we can model them, but we can't know them. That's why withdrawal rates are always moving targets. 2. Inflation. Inflation is the silent thief of retirement. A retiree spending $50,000 today may need $80,000 or more years from now just to maintain the same lifestyle. And if inflation surprises us, the math changes dramatically. 3. Volatility. Not all returns arrive smoothly. Sometimes markets soar, sometimes they collapse, and those ups and downs matter much more in retirement than during your working years. 4. Sequence of returns risk. We'll spend a lot of time on this later because it's one of the most misunderstood concepts in retirement planning. The order of returns matters a lot. 5. Longevity. How long will retirement last? 20 years? 30 years? 40 years? The longer the timeline, the more careful we must be. The hidden role of market valuations. Let's talk about something most retirees never think about. Price. Not the price of groceries, not the price of gas, the price of the stock market itself. Because just as paying too much for a house can reduce future returns, paying too much for stocks can do the same thing. This is where researchers often look at something called the CAPE ratio, the cyclically adjusted price-to-earnings ratio, developed and popularized by economist Robert Shiller. Now, don't let the fancy name intimidate you. The basic idea is simple. The CAPE ratio asks, how expensive is the stock market compared to its long-term earnings? When that number is very high, stocks tend to be expensive. When it's low, stocks tend to be cheap. And historically, investors who buy expensive markets often experience lower future returns than investors who buy cheaper markets. Not always, but often enough that retirement researchers pay close attention. Because valuation matters, price matters. What you pay matters, whether you're buying a stock, a business, or a home. And retirement planning is no different. The bond yield story nobody talks about. Now let's shift to bonds, because bonds don't get nearly as much attention as stocks. They're not exciting. Nobody brags about their bond portfolio at dinner parties. But retirees should care deeply about bond yields. Why? Because bond yields tell us a lot about future expected returns. If a government bond is yielding 5%, your expected return over the next decade is probably somewhere close to that. Not exactly, but roughly. If that same bond yields 1%, your expectations should be lower. This matters because many retirees own portfolios that include bonds, sometimes 30%, sometimes 40%, sometimes more. So when yields rise, retirement math improves. When yields fall, retirement math becomes more challenging. And that's exactly why sustainable withdrawal rates change over time. The environment changes. The math changes, the recommendation changes. 2 retirees, 2 completely different outcomes. Let me tell you a story. Imagine 2 retirees, same age, same portfolio, same discipline, same spending goals, everything identical, except for one thing, the year they retire. Retiree number 1 retires in 1982. Retiree number 2 retires in 2000. At first glance, that difference doesn't sound significant, but it changed everything. The retiree entering retirement in 1982 stepped into one of the most favorable investing environments in modern history. Stocks were relatively cheap, bond yields were incredibly high, inflation was beginning to cool, the economic winds were shifting in their favor. The retiree in 2000 experienced something completely different. They retired at the peak of the technology bubble. Stock valuations were sky high. Expectations were unrealistic. Markets had become euphoric. And shortly afterward, reality arrived. The dot-com crash. The financial crisis. Years of disappointing returns. Same retirees, same withdrawal strategy, same discipline, wildly different outcomes. because starting conditions matter more than most people realize. And that's one of the most important lessons in retirement planning. The environment you retire into matters, sometimes a lot. Why Morningstar's number keeps changing. One of the things that confuses retirees the most is seeing different withdrawal rate recommendations from year to year. One year, researchers might suggest something around 3.7%. A few years later, it might be 4.2%. Then maybe 4.5%. Then perhaps back down again. And people often look at those changing numbers and think, wait a minute, if the experts keep changing the answer, how can I trust any of this? But here's the reality. The changing number is actually proof that the research is working. Think about weather forecasts. Imagine if a meteorologist predicted sunshine every day regardless of the season. You wouldn't trust them. The reason we trust weather forecasts is because they adjust to changing conditions. Retirement planning works the same way. When stock prices become extremely expensive, future returns tend to be lower. When bond yields fall dramatically, future returns tend to be lower. When inflation spikes, spending pressure increases. Researchers aren't changing the answer because they're guessing. They're changing the answer because the inputs changed. And if the inputs change, the output should change too. This is exactly what organizations like Morningstar have been doing for years. Instead of asking, what withdrawal rate worked in the past, they're asking, given today's market conditions, what withdrawal rate seems prudent going forward? That distinction may sound small, but it's enormous. One approach looks backward, the other looks forward. And retirees need both perspectives, the famous 4% rule. Now let's talk about the most famous retirement rule ever created, the 4% rule. Even if you've never read a retirement research paper, you've probably heard someone mention it, and there's a good reason. The 4% rule changed retirement planning forever. Back in the 1990s, researcher Bill Bengen asked a fascinating question. He looked through decades of market history and asked, what withdrawal rate would have survived even the worst retirement periods? His research examined retirees starting all the way back in the 1920s. Wars, inflation, recessions, market crashes, economic turmoil, everything. And after running the numbers, he found something remarkable. A retiree who started by withdrawing approximately 4% of their portfolio and adjusted that spending for inflation each year generally survived even the most difficult historical periods. That finding became legendary, because before then, retirement planning was largely guesswork. The 4% rule gave people a framework, a starting point, a benchmark, a way to think about retirement income. And for that reason alone, Bill Bengen deserves enormous credit. But here's where people sometimes misunderstand the rule. The 4% rule was never intended to be a law of nature. It wasn't meant to be universal. It wasn't meant to work identically in every environment. It was historical research, and historical research has limits, because the future doesn't always resemble the past. The danger of blindly following rules. One of the biggest financial mistakes people make is turning useful guidelines into absolute truths. The 4% rule is a fantastic guideline, but retirement isn't a paint-by-numbers exercise. It's real life, and real life is messy. Let's imagine someone retires with $1 million portfolio. Following the traditional rule, they withdraw $40,000 during their first year. Everything seems fine, but then the market drops 30%. Inflation surges. Bond returns disappoint. Suddenly, the portfolio isn't worth $1 million anymore. Maybe it's worth $700,000. Yet the retiree is still withdrawing roughly the same amount. Without realizing it, their effective withdrawal rate has risen dramatically. The risk profile changed, the environment changed, but their behavior didn't. This is why modern retirement planning has evolved beyond simple static rules. The goal isn't blind consistency. The goal is intelligent adaptation. Retirement isn't about being right. This may be one of the most important concepts I'll share today. Successful retirees are not the people who perfectly predict the future. They don't know exactly what inflation will do. They don't know where the stock market will be next year. They don't know what interest rates will look like 5 years from now. Nobody does. The retirees who succeed are usually the ones who remain adaptable. They're willing to make small adjustments when circumstances change. They're willing to be flexible. And flexibility turns out to be incredibly powerful. In fact, retirement research repeatedly shows something surprising. The people who are willing to make modest spending adjustments often end up being able to spend more overall than those who insist on following rigid rules. That sounds backward, but it's true, because flexibility acts like a shock absorber. It helps absorb the impact of difficult markets, the silent threat called sequence risk. Now we need to talk about what may be the single most important risk in retirement: sequence of returns risk. The name sounds complicated, but the concept is actually simple. Let's imagine two investors, Investor A and Investor B. Both earn the exact same average return over 20 years. Same average return, same ending percentage. Yet one ends up wealthy while the other struggles. How can that happen? The answer is timing. When you're working and contributing money, market declines can actually help you. You're buying shares at lower prices. You're accumulating. You're in growth mode. But retirement changes everything. Now you're withdrawing money. You're selling assets. You're depending on the portfolio. So if major losses occur early in retirement, the damage can become permanent. Imagine retiring today, then experiencing a 35% market decline next year. You're not just watching your portfolio fall, you're also withdrawing money while it's falling. You're selling shares when prices are depressed. Those shares are gone forever. They don't participate in the recovery later. That's sequence risk, and it's one of the biggest reasons why retirement outcomes can differ dramatically. Not because one retiree invested better, not because one retiree was smarter, but because timing treated them differently. The retirement years that terrified researchers. When retirement researchers study history, certain years appear over and over again. These retirement cohorts faced extraordinary challenges, not because they did anything wrong, but because they entered retirement during difficult market environments. Some faced high inflation. Some faced weak stock returns. Some faced both. And those early challenges created stress that lasted for years. What makes retirement so unique is that the first decade matters disproportionately. A difficult first decade can create problems that echo throughout retirement. A strong first decade can create opportunities that last for decades. It's almost like planting a tree. The early years determine much of its future growth, and retirement portfolios behave similarly. That's why many advisors focus intensely on protecting retirees during those early years. Because if you can successfully navigate that period, the odds often improve dramatically. Why flexibility changes everything. Here's where retirement planning becomes much more hopeful. Because when people hear about sequence risk, they often become scared. They think, well, if markets can destroy my plan early, what can I do? The answer is flexibility. Let's go back to our $1 million retiree. Suppose they start with a $40,000 annual withdrawal. Then markets experience a difficult period. Instead of stubbornly increasing spending every year regardless of circumstances, they make a few modest adjustments. Maybe they postpone a major vacation. Maybe they skip a spending increase for 1 year. Maybe they delay a home renovation. Maybe they cut discretionary spending temporarily. Notice what they aren't doing. They're not living in poverty. They're not panicking. They're not dramatically changing their lifestyle. They're simply adapting. And those small adaptations can have an outsized impact on long-term success. In many cases, a temporary spending adjustment of 5% to 10% can significantly improve retirement sustainability. That's an incredible trade-off. A relatively small sacrifice today can create substantially more security tomorrow. And perhaps even more importantly, it provides something retirees desperately need: confidence. Because retirement isn't just mathematics, it's emotional, it's psychological, it's deeply personal, and confidence matters a lot. One of the most important developments in retirement research over the past 2 decades has been the idea of guardrails. Now, don't let the term sound overly technical. A guardrail is simply a pre-planned adjustment. Think about driving down a mountain road. The guardrails aren't there because someone expects you to crash. They're there because unexpected things happen. Retirement planning works the same way. Guardrails create boundaries that help keep your plan on track. Instead of saying, I'm going to withdraw the exact same way forever no matter what happens, you say, if things go really well, I'll allow myself to spend a little more. And if things become challenging, I'll temporarily pull back. That's it. Simple, practical, human, and surprisingly effective. Researchers like Jonathan Guyton and William Klinger demonstrated that retirees who followed guardrail systems often enjoyed better outcomes than retirees who followed rigid withdrawal strategies. Because life itself isn't rigid. Life changes, markets change, families change, health changes, and retirement plans should acknowledge that reality. Why most retirees spend less over time anyway. Here's something fascinating. Many people assume retirement spending rises forever, but research often shows the opposite. In fact, many retirees naturally spend less as they age, not because they're forced to, not because they're struggling, simply because life changes. Think about your own retirement dreams. Maybe you want to travel, take cruises, visit family, explore new places, enjoy hobbies. Those activities often happen during the earlier years of retirement. Financial planners sometimes call these the go-go years. You're healthy, you're energetic, you're active, you're eager to enjoy the freedom you've spent decades earning. Then something interesting happens. Over time, priorities begin to shift. The constant travel slows. The bucket list adventures become less frequent. Life becomes simpler, more focused, more intentional. Researchers, including David Blanchett, have found that inflation-adjusted spending often declines naturally during much of retirement. Not dramatically, but enough to matter. And that's good news, because it means many retirees unknowingly create additional margin for safety as they age. Their spending declines while their portfolio continues working. Their withdrawal rate gradually becomes more sustainable. And many eventually discover they have more financial flexibility than they originally feared. The retirement surprise nobody expects. One of the most surprising conversations I have with retirees is this. Many people enter retirement terrified they'll run out of money. Then, 10 or 15 years later, they're worried about something entirely different. They're worried they haven't spent enough. Think about that. The fear shifts. At first, the concern is survival. Later, the concern becomes purpose, legacy, impact, enjoyment. I've seen retirees who spent their first few years watching every dollar, carefully monitoring every expense, constantly worrying, only to discover 20 years later that their portfolio is stronger than ever. Their Social Security benefits are covering much of their essential spending. Their investments have grown, their mortgage is gone, their lifestyle is simpler, and suddenly they realize, I could have enjoyed more. That realization can be bittersweet, because money isn't the goal, life is. Money is simply a tool that helps support the life you want. And sometimes retirement planning becomes so focused on avoiding failure that we forget the purpose of success. Success isn't dying with the largest portfolio. Success is using your resources to create a meaningful life. The emotional side of retirement. Let's be honest, most retirement conversations focus heavily on math. Percentages, projections, withdrawal rates, market returns, probability charts, all important. But retirement is also deeply emotional. In many ways, retirement represents one of life's biggest transitions. For decades, your identity may have been tied to your career, your schedule, your routine, your responsibilities. Then suddenly, everything changes. You have freedom, but freedom can feel surprisingly uncomfortable at first. You have time, but time requires direction. You have financial decisions to make without the reassurance of another paycheck arriving every 2 weeks. That's why retirement planning is about far more than spreadsheets. It's about confidence. It's about peace of mind. It's about knowing that you can enjoy your life without constantly looking over your shoulder. And that's exactly why flexibility matters so much. A rigid plan often creates anxiety. A flexible plan creates resilience. And resilience creates confidence. Building a retirement income system. So if retirement isn't about finding one magical withdrawal rate, what should retirees focus on instead? The answer is building a complete income system. Notice the difference. Not a number, a system. Because systems adapt. Systems evolve. Systems survive. Let's talk about what that system might look like. A reasonable starting withdrawal rate. You need a starting point, whether it's 3.8%, 4.2%, 4.5%, or somewhere else. The exact number matters less than many people think. What's important is starting from a reasonable position based on current market conditions. Social Security optimization. For many retirees, Social Security becomes one of the most valuable assets they own. Not because it's exciting, but because it's predictable. It's guaranteed income. And guaranteed income creates stability. Delaying benefits when appropriate can dramatically increase future income and reduce pressure on investment portfolios. Cash reserves. Cash isn't there to maximize returns. It's there to provide flexibility. A cash reserve can help retirees avoid selling investments during difficult markets. Sometimes peace of mind is worth more than an extra percentage point of return. Tax planning. Taxes matter. A lot. The difference between withdrawing money efficiently and withdrawing money carelessly can add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars over retirement. Smart retirement planning isn't just about earning returns. It's about keeping more of what you've earned. Spending flexibility. This may be the most powerful tool of all. Not because you'll use it constantly, but because having the option changes everything. The ability to adjust spending by even a small amount can dramatically improve long-term outcomes. And it gives retirees something invaluable: control. What makes retirement plans fail? Many people assume retirement plans fail because of poor investment returns. Sometimes that's true, but often the real cause is much simpler: inflexibility, a refusal to adapt, a belief that the original plan must remain unchanged regardless of what happens. Imagine trying to drive across the country while refusing to adjust your route. Road closed? Keep going. Traffic jam? Keep going. Bridge out? Keep going. That would be absurd. Yet that's exactly how some people approach retirement planning. The best plans aren't rigid. They're responsive. They recognize that unexpected things happen, and they adapt accordingly. What retirement research has taught us. If you step back and look at everything retirement researchers have learned over the past several decades, one message rises above all the rest. There is no perfect withdrawal rate. There is only a reasonable starting point combined with thoughtful decision-making. Researchers like Michael Kitces, Wade Pfau, David Blanchett, Bill Bengen, and many others have spent years studying retirement outcomes. And despite approaching the problem from different angles, their work often points toward the same conclusion. The starting environment matters. Valuations matter. Bond yields matter. Inflation matters. But flexibility matters too, perhaps more than anything else. Because retirement isn't a single decision made on day one. It's a journey that may last 30 years or more. And no single number can fully capture that reality.